What you're looking at is Texas Tower 4. It was one of a small number of radar platforms just like it, each one anchored miles out into the open Atlantic Ocean, completely surrounded by water on every side. The conditions out there were punishing. The work was dangerous. This is the story of what happened to Texas Tower 4. As always, viewer discretion is advised. In the anxious heart of 1950s America. And one of the most pressing concerns for the United States military at the time was the threat posed by Soviet long-range bomber aircraft, enemy planes crossing the Atlantic undetected, reaching the American coastline before anyone had time to react, with no warning and no opportunity for interception. The answer the Air Force developed was as bold as the problem was serious. A chain of enormous radar platforms would be constructed and anchored in the Atlantic Ocean, positioned miles offshore where they could detect incoming aircraft far earlier than any land-based system could, with enough advance notice. Estimates ranged from 30 to 60 minutes. Fighter jets could be scrambled and air defenses put on alert before any threat reached American airspace. And these offshore platforms were given the name Texas Towers. The nickname came from their visual similarity to the oil drilling rigs that operated in the Gulf of Mexico off the Texas coast. Both designs relied on elevated platforms held up by steel legs driven into the seafloor. Multiple towers were planned and eventually built, but one stood apart from the rest in terms of its location, its ambition, and ultimately its fate. Texas Tower 4 was placed 63 miles, about 101 kilometers, off the eastern shore of Long Island, New York. The water beneath it reached 185 feet deep, or approximately 56 meters. No other tower was positioned so far out or in such deep water. Strategically, the placement made sense. Pushing the radar coverage that far into the Atlantic gave the military a detection window it had never had before. From a purely operational standpoint, Tower 4 was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. The problems, though, had started long before the radar ever came online. Work on Texas Tower 4 got underway in December of 1956, beginning on dry land in South Portland, Maine. The project was assigned to two large construction firms working in partnership, J. Rich Steers of New York City and Morrison Knudsen based out of Idaho. Their task was to design and build a structure capable of standing permanently in one of the most hostile stretches of ocean in the world and surviving whatever the North Atlantic threw at it. The construction approach followed a logical sequence: build the platform onshore, tow it out to the designated location, sink the legs into the seafloor, secure everything in place, and bring the radar equipment online. On June 28, 1957, the platform was successfully floated and towed out to its position, a milestone that looked like a success until a closer inspection revealed what the journey had done to the structure. As the tower moved through the ocean swells during the tow, 2 or 3 of its key structural supports had been knocked loose and damaged. These were the connections between the 3 main legs, long steel columns that would be driven into the ocean floor to hold the entire platform in place. The platform itself sat atop these legs, spanning an area roughly comparable to a football field, with large, rounded radar enclosures mounted above the working surface, along with crew quarters, generators, and all supporting equipment. With the damage discovered and the structure already in position, why the Air Force made a decision that would define everything that came after. Rather than tow the platform back to shore for proper repairs, they would fix it where it was. While that work was being attempted, another storm moved in. One of the horizontal and diagonal bracing supports, the cross members that connected the legs and provided the structure with its lateral rigidity, was broken off completely by the weather. The Navy then attempted to address the combined damage through a series of underwater repair operations, attaching new brace sections to the broken stubs using large steel collar clamps bolted around the damaged areas beneath the surface. The repairs were not successful. When divers examined the results, they found bolts that were the wrong size for the holes they had been placed in, U-fasteners that could be pulled free with bare hands, and fittings that had clearly been rushed into place without proper fitting. A formal assessment published at the close of 1958, specifically addressing Tower 4's condition, documented these failures clearly and concluded that the structure had significant unresolved deficiencies. The response to that report was to keep moving forward anyway. The radar enclosures were installed, the electronics were brought online, and the tower was declared ready for service. It shook, it groaned under load. It made the personnel who worked on it uneasy in ways that were hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. But the radar was working, and for the moment, that was the priority. Recruiting people to serve aboard the Texas Towers turned out to require a certain amount of creative marketing. The Air Force ran advertisements in military publications that described a posting on the towers as something resembling a comfortable offshore assignment. The listings emphasized good food, solid accommodations, hobby facilities, nightly film screenings, and generous fishing access. Personnel were also offered 2 weeks of leave for every 6 weeks spent on the platforms. The advertisements generated a significant number of applicants. What they did not describe was the experience of actually being there. The platforms never stopped moving. Even in relatively calm conditions, the sway was constant and disorienting. The radar enclosures produced vibrations that passed through the entire structure. Diesel generators ran around the clock, creating a mechanical drone that never fully disappeared. And the steel legs extending down through the water column functioned almost like giant resonating tubes, picking up sounds from the ocean floor and transmitting them upward through the platform as groans, booms, and low metallic rumblings that seemed to come from everywhere at once. A condition referred to as tower fever was documented among personnel who had been stationed there for extended periods. It was characterized as a mounting psychological unease, the cumulative effect of complete isolation, gray skies that seemed to never fully clear, wind that rarely dropped below uncomfortable, and the ever-present awareness that departure depended entirely on someone else showing up to make it possible. Crew transfers were their own ordeal. The helicopter operations between the tower and the mainland were considered hazardous enough that the Air Force required 2 aircraft to fly together on every rotation. One would land on the platform while the second held position nearby in case the first ended up in the water. When weather conditions were poor, which was often, flights were suspended entirely. Transfers between the platform and supply ships below used a system that had been given the informal name, the donut. It consisted of a large rubber tube from an aircraft tire suspended by a crane over the water. Personnel would grip the tube and hold on while being lowered, sometimes dropped, down to the deck of a ship rolling in the swells beneath them. Experienced sailors and airmen alike found the process deeply unpleasant. Efforts to keep morale at a functional level included occasional barbecues, pizza sessions, distributed beer rations, and the movie screenings that the recruitment advertisements had promised. But the appeal of those activities had a ceiling when the walls were shaking, the generators were running at full output, and the foghorn, at the time considered the most powerful in the world, was sounding every 29 seconds during periods of reduced visibility. The design specifications for the Texas Towers indicated they could withstand winds of 125 miles per hour and wave heights above 35 feet, or roughly 10.5 meters. Conditions well short of those figures still caused noticeable and uncomfortable movement. Towers 2 and 3 sitting in shallower water, they had a natural stability advantage over Tower 4, and even they were not comfortable places to be in rough weather. Tower 4 moved in a way that set it apart. Personnel didn't describe it as standing on something solid. They described it as riding something that was in constant, unpredictable motion. The crew called it Old Shaky, and the name required no explanation to anyone who had spent time aboard it. The strategic picture surrounding the tower was also changing in ways that made its continued operation harder to justify. The Texas Towers had been designed around the threat of Soviet bomber aircraft, large planes flying long, slow routes across the Atlantic at relatively low altitude. By 1961, that threat had been substantially replaced by intercontinental ballistic missiles. A missile didn't fly slow or low, and it traveled at thousands of miles per hour on a high arc, and by the time Tower 4's radar could have registered one, the time to impact would have been measured in seconds rather than minutes. The 30 to 60-minute warning window that had once justified the tower's existence had essentially been eliminated. In spite of this, the decision was made to keep Tower 4 operational and staffed. The driving concern was the possibility of Soviet salvage. American intelligence suggested that Russian naval vessels were operating in the general area, and military planners were unwilling to leave classified radar technology unattended, where it might be boarded and removed. Maintaining a crew on the platform was seen as the only reliable deterrent. The crew size was reduced from a peak of 70 personnel down to 28, 14 Air Force airmen and 14 civilian contractors, most of them there in a maintenance capacity. Their primary function was no longer early warning. It was keeping a deteriorating structure from falling apart and preventing unauthorized access. By the time 1961 began, Texas Tower 4 was surviving on borrowed time. The underwater bracing that had been improperly repaired years earlier had continued to weaken. The foundation situation was particularly alarming when compared against the other towers. While Tower 2 had its legs driven 48 feet, roughly 15 meters, into the seafloor, the legs of Tower 4 had been sunk only 18 feet, or about 5 meters, into sand. Less than half the depth in deeper and more turbulent water, with a structure that had already sustained significant storm damage. Hurricane Donna had passed through in September of 1960 and delivered what turned out to be a defining blow. The storm brought sustained winds of 132 miles per hour and wave heights that exceeded 50 feet, around 15 meters, both well beyond what the tower had been built to withstand. When Donna moved on and inspections were carried out, engineers determined that the underwater bracing had cracked and shifted badly enough that the structure had lost approximately half of its total load-bearing capacity. Tower 4 was still standing, but a single severe storm at this point was likely all it would take. The men living on it already knew this. No formal assessment was needed to tell them. The sway had become more pronounced, and the creaking had grown louder and more frequent. Vibrations that had always been present were now more intense. The dark joke that had circulated among the crew for years, that Tower 4 was no place to use a straight razor, had stopped feeling like a joke. The commanding officer on Tower 4, Captain Gordon Phelan, had been communicating his concerns up the chain of command for an extended period. He had submitted repeated requests for the authority to order a crew evacuation if conditions required it. Those requests had been denied each time. The decision-making power remained with officers at Otis Air Force Base on Cape Cod, on solid ground, far from the tower. In the middle of January 1961, the captain of the Navy supply vessel that made regular runs to Tower 4, Captain Sixto Mangual, contacted Gordon directly with a warning. Conditions were deteriorating. Wind and sea state were both trending in the wrong direction. If an evacuation was going to happen, Sixto said, the decision needed to be made soon. Gordon relayed the message. He still did not have the authority to act on it himself. The forecast issued on the evening of January 14th called for winds between 46 and 69 miles per hour. The tower had come through similar conditions just 6 days earlier without serious incident. The forecast was unwelcome but not immediately alarming. On January 15th, the storm accelerated beyond what anyone had predicted. By 10 in the morning, helicopter operations were already out of the question. Wave heights had made any form of personnel transfer impossible. When Gordon was asked whether he was concerned, his answer was direct. It no longer made a difference, because the window for evacuation had already closed. Shortly after 1 in the afternoon, Gordon called his wife. He told her the tower was moving in ways he had not felt before. He told her that if it went into the ocean, the water would take all of them. There would be no rescue operation. The January Atlantic did not allow for that kind of outcome. At 3:30 that afternoon, the forecast was revised upward to include gusts reaching 86 miles per hour. 30 minutes later, Gordon radioed Otis to report a sharp cracking sound from somewhere in the structure and a noticeable increase in the degree of sway. Authorization to evacuate was granted. It was too late, and everyone involved understood that. Surface vessels from the Navy and Coast Guard were dispatched, but they were still hours away from the tower's position. And the storm was already fully on top of the structure, with helicopter flights impossible and wave conditions ruling out any transfer method. There was nothing to do but wait. Gordon called his wife again at 6 in the evening. Wave heights, he said, were at 35 feet. Wind speeds had passed 98 miles per hour. On the platform above, crew members were working in those conditions to throw classified materials overboard, including locked safes containing sensitive documents, to keep them out of enemy hands in the event the tower was evacuated or lost. At 6:45 in the evening, the final distress transmission came from Tower 4. The message stated that the structure was coming apart. Around 15 minutes after that, Gordon reached Sixto by radio one final time. He told him to move the supply ship to safe water immediately and not to wait. Sixto turned the vessel around. He stood at the radar display and watched the return signal from Tower 4. At 7:28 in the evening on January 15, 1961, the signal vanished. Texas Tower 4 had gone into the Atlantic. Every one of the 28 men on board went with it. None of them survived. In the days that followed, only 2 bodies were ever recovered from the water. The collapse of Texas Tower 4 triggered an immediate and wide-ranging response. At Otis Air Force Base, a formal board of inquiry was assembled within days. As investigators worked through the sequence of events, a particularly damaging piece of information surfaced. In the period leading up to the collapse, Gordon's superiors had apparently already authorized him to call for an evacuation at his own discretion if he believed conditions made it necessary. And Gordon had never been informed of this. He had sent request after request asking for exactly that authority, receiving denials in return, while the authorization he was asking for had apparently already been approved somewhere in the command structure and simply failed to reach him. Criminal proceedings followed. A colonel serving in a senior role within the Boston Air Defense Sector was charged with involuntary manslaughter. 2 additional officers were charged with dereliction of duty. For a period, it appeared that the deaths of 28 men would result in meaningful legal consequences. By June of 1961, the charges against 2 of the officers had been dismissed. By August, a court-martial panel had cleared the colonel of all remaining charges. The entire case had dissolved in the space of a few months, without a single conviction or formal finding of individual responsibility. No penalties were imposed. No one was held accountable in any legal sense. The Senate conducted separate hearings and reached conclusions that were considerably less accommodating. The committee's findings identified human error at multiple levels of the process, among engineers, construction contractors, and within both the Air Force and the Navy, as the underlying cause of the disaster. The Navy was singled out specifically for the manner in which it had overseen construction and the subsequent repair work on the tower. One of the most striking technical details to emerge from the investigation was the comparison between Tower 4's foundation and that of the more stable Tower 2. Tower 2 had its legs sunk 48 feet, or about 15 meters, into the seafloor. On Tower 4's legs had gone down only 18 feet, approximately 5 meters, into sandy, unstable ground in water that was far deeper and subject to far greater forces, a fraction of the depth. In the most exposed position of all the towers, the public was left with a question the hearings raised but did not fully resolve. How does a structure built in the name of national security become responsible for the deaths of the people manning it? How do repeated warnings go unanswered, repairs remain inadequate, and authorization for evacuation go undelivered all at once, in the same place at the same time? The answers that came back pointed to overlapping institutional failures and a set of priorities that consistently placed concerns about Soviet salvage above concerns about the men physically on the platform. The legal proceedings ended without consequence. Assignments were quietly adjusted. The public moved on. The families of the 28 men received none of the accountability they were owed. The remains of Texas Tower 4 are still on the ocean floor 185 feet beneath the surface of the Atlantic. The depth makes casual diving impossible, but experienced wreck divers have descended to the site. What they find is a structure that has been reclaimed by the seafloor, encrusted with marine growth, inhabited by sea life, slowly becoming indistinguishable from the environment around it. For most of the decades since 1961, the Texas towers have existed at the edge of public memory. They were a product of a specific strategic moment that passed quickly, overtaken by technology and rendered obsolete almost as soon as they became operational. And the other platforms were decommissioned and removed. Tower 4 went into the ocean on its own terms. But the 28 men who were on it that January night deserve to be remembered for what they actually were. They were not casualties of combat. No enemy action brought the tower down. They were men assigned to a job, operating under orders on a structure that multiple levels of their own organization had documented as unsafe. And they were kept there anyway because the decision makers who had the authority to remove them chose not to use it until it was far too late. Pause. If you made it to the end, thank you for watching Creepy Real Stories. If you have a story you think belongs on this channel, drop it in the comments or use the link in the description. Like and subscribe for more stories like this one. I'll see you in the next one.